Hey there, welcome back. Before we get into talking about each sacrament, I need to tell you that two of them are going to take a little bit longer to talk about, and that would be the sacrament of... So what I'm going to do is divide the lessons in two, so you're not there all, oh man, this is so boring, I wish you'd hurry up. There'd be none of that, right? Okay. Actually, talking about baptism is so important that there will probably be at least 4 videos. Okay? So let's get started talking about baptism. Now, if you're really interested, nothing's stopping you from watching the videos all at one time. You go right ahead. Now, this is part 1 of the Sacrament of Baptism. So I'm hoping that you can think back to the video on relationships and how I spoke about the way your relationship with God began. Before we do that, I need to read you a passage from the Bible, from the very first chapter of the very first book in the Bible. In the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. Now the earth was formless and empty, and darkness was all over the surface of the deep. And the Spirit of God was hovering over the surface of the waters. And God said, "Let there be light," and there was light. And God saw that the light was good. And he separated the light from darkness. He called the light day, and the darkness he called night. Then there was evening. Then there was morning, the very first day. That's an awesome story, and you need to read it for yourself in your Bible. Here's the point. From the very beginning of time, people believed that God called forth life from an ocean. And you know what? Scientists today agree with that. They know that the very first life actually was formed in the earliest ocean. So now, look at this. Here's a baby. Where's the baby? Inside its mother's womb. The baby is floating around and being formed by water. Wow. We all know that without water, everything on our planet would die. We need it to drink. We need it to grow crops. We need it to stay clean and healthy. As time went on in history, people began to develop societies and religions. Water also became an important part of spiritual thinking. It connected them to God, and it became an important part of customs and celebrations and ceremonies. So, there's one more thing I'd like for you to think about in relation to water. What happens if there's no rain? That's right. Crops will fail, and animals will die. Now what happens if there's too much rain? You're right again. Damage, drowning, disaster, and death. So early people believed that water was a symbol. It was a sign. Remember we talked about signs? It was a sign of the reality of life and death. And they believed that God used water to bring both life and death. One more thing, one more story. I hope you do know the story of the Exodus. If not, you really need to read that in your Bible too. It's a fantastic story. It's an important story. But let me give you the short version. About 3,500 years ago, the people of Israel were slaves in Egypt. And obviously, they wanted to be free. Now, there's a whole bunch of stories in Exodus about how God helped to make that happen. And they're pretty adventurous, I can tell you. Well, there were 10 plagues that God sent upon Egypt. And that's the really interesting bit of the story. It's just amazing to read how much trouble, how much fighting, how much disaster took place. So let me tell you what the 10 plagues are. There was a plague of blood, frogs, lice, flies, livestock dying, boils all over people, hail from heaven in the desert, mind you, a plague of locusts, a plague of darkness, and finally, the most terrible, the death of the firstborn child of every family in Egypt that did not show allegiance to God. I bet you want to read it now. Anyway, the ruler of Egypt finally told them to go. Just go. And the people of Israel packed up and they set out, thousands of them. Now, after they had left, Pharaoh changed his mind. He was pretty mad after all that had happened to Egypt. And so once they got part way on their journey, not very far, his embarrassment and his fear turned to anger. And he decided to take an army and wipe them out. In other words, he was going to have his revenge. And you know, he caught up with them by the Red Sea. And so what you had was an army on one side and the sea on the other side, and the people of Israel in the middle. They had nowhere to go. So the story unfolds. Moses, their leader, stood by the waves and said to the people, "Don't be afraid." And he lifted his hands, and the wind began to blow, and the waters of the sea parted. And the people of Israel went through on dry land to safety on the other side, to freedom and to new life. And oh yes, the Egyptians chased them. And as the story unfolds, the sad, sad story, when the Egyptians got into the part of the sea, God caused the water to close in on them, and they all died. I know it's a pretty violent story, but you know, it became part of the sacred story of the nation of Israel, and they used it to teach lessons of life and death, of captivity and freedom, of choosing to trust God and going through the water, or staying and not living. And so later in history, the stories of the parting of the Red Sea and the Exodus became very, very important to the people of Israel. And one of the many traditions that developed because of it is one that we call today the Mikvah. The Mikvah became part of the spiritual life of Hebrew people. What they would do is step into a ritual bath. They would be clean. They would walk down into this pool of water, say a prayer or prayers. A priest would pronounce a blessing, and they would walk out the other side. And the symbolism of that is that they were now clean and forgiven. It's a beautiful tradition when you think about it, and it's still being done today. We do something with water too that is very important to us in the church. We call it baptism. And before I explain what your baptism means, I have to help you understand how Jesus understood baptism. So now I'm going to ask you to move along with me. Let's talk about Jesus. You remember?